Okay, hi everyone. I'm Taylor. As you know, I'm going to be talking about Izcalli of the Wind. Together with my team, we are Axolotl Productions. So before I begin, just in the time since Vertical Slice, we've spent our development time addressing any remaining questions and ideas that we might have before starting production, which we did this week. So today, instead of seeing the progress along the track we laid forth last month at Vertical Slice, you're going to be seeing more broad, more varied progress that we've made that reflects the team's interests and the areas that we wanted to explore before entering production. So during this presentation, I'm just going to be touching on the different areas of development and sharing the progress that we have made in those areas. But first, I want to spend a couple of minutes just quickly reviewing our game and what it's all about. So in Izcalli of the Wind, the objective is to use movement to manipulate energy to repower the temple that will connect the divine and mortal realms. So in this way, you are a kinetic spark that will restore power to a divine machine. So the world of Izcalli of the Wind is a divine realm, the home of the god of wind, who is inspired by the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. There used to be a connection between this realm and the human realm, but over time, as people lost faith in the god of wind, he and his realm both lost power. In an attempt to preserve both himself and the realm, he sealed himself within a relic, and he chose a hoverboard because he knew it would allow him to still use some of his wind abilities even while trapped. So he remains dormant within that hoverboard until the spark of the believer reignites his power, and that's where Izcalli comes in. She still believes in the god of wind. She uses clues within local stories and myths to find a lost temple, the hoverboard, and the god within. When she finds it, her belief awakens the god of wind within the board, and she's transported to his world where she's able to channel his energy to navigate. So it's up to her to manipulate the remaining energy in this realm to restore the temple, to restore belief in the mortal realm of the god of wind. So it's up to Izcalli to become the rebirth of the wind. So like I said before, the objective of the game is to use movement to manipulate energy to power the temple. The player does that using this hoverboard, which acts as a sort of divine battery that holds this divine energy. So some actions power the battery while other actions deplete the battery. And in addition, the battery can hold an excess of energy, but the player must maintain kinetic energy to hold that. So they have to maintain their max speed in order to maintain that excess energy. A key relationship in our game is that between the hoverboard and the slipstreams of energy. So the player is able to use the board to deposit and withdraw energy from the slipstreams, but they have to be careful to maintain a balance, because if they take too much out and the energy of the slipstream becomes too low, then it becomes dormant and it's no longer helping them to move quickly. But if they put too much into the slipstream, then it's too high and it's unstable, and it's really difficult to navigate and stay on the slipstream. So the goal is to maintain a balance and keep a nice stable slipstream that still gives speed without throwing you off. So that's how the player uses movement to manipulate energy. The way in which this is used to repower the temple is through what we're calling conduction trials. So each major island is going to have a conduit like this one, and as the player completes the conduction trials, they will repower this conduit, and then once all the conduits are repowered, then the temple will be restored. One of our trials is a time trial. In a time trial, the player will have to fly quickly through the environment in a set amount of time in order to activate all the breakers and then return to the seal, which will then become activated. Then we have a payload trial. I mentioned before that the hoverboard can hold an excess of energy, and this is where that comes in. So in a payload trial, the player has to gain an excess of energy, maintain it by traveling at max speed, and then bring it to a seal, which will require that amount of energy, which is greater than what the board usually holds. So with that review, I'm going to go on to talk about art. So this is what we had at Vertical Slice for our environment assets. These assets are structural pieces that make the world, but we wanted to add some more character to the world. So what we have here is a fountain. So in the center of this mountain, you can see a feathered serpent and an axolotl. That's particularly interesting because in Aztec mythology, the feathered serpent represents Quetzalcoatl, who's inspired our god of wind, and the axolotl represents his twin, Xalath. So we also started some work on some visual effects. So the main thing that the player is going to be powering up is our seals. Once all of those are powered up, then the conduit will be restored. So what you're seeing here, this isn't our seal. However, the visual effect on it is what we plan to use on our seals to bring attention to them in the world. Also, our realm in our game is in a state of neglect. So it only makes sense that there would be some type of grunge on the objects in the world. So we created this visual effect, which puts, right now it's moss, but it could be a different type of dirt or grunge on the objects, and it can fade away. So the intent is to use this to represent to the player that they are repowering the world. So as they progress, objects in the world are returning to their pristine state. So we also got to work on a couple of tools. We have a lot of these floating islands in our game. They're not only where our levels are taking place, but they're also floating around the sky, creating the feel of the world that we're playing in. And it takes a lot of time to create each individual one of these islands by hand, and it's just an impractical use of our resources. So we just made this island generator, which speeds that up for us a lot. It gives us a lot of control over our islands, and they can be as unique as we want them to be. So we can change the perimeter shape of it, and we can also change the elevations both on top and beneath the island. This is also true for rocks in our game. We have a lot of rocks in our environment, and we wanted to maximize the amount of team-generated content we have in our game. So this will allow us to generate a lot of rocks made by the team without having to have just making a bunch of rocks, basically. So that brings us to level design. So one big thing, we decided to revisit our plans for our main island. So set dressing went on the back burner over this past month. So instead we focused on some more world level lighting that we could use regardless of how the island was going to be used. So we created this day-night cycle here. We're going to use this to show progression in the game, not just progression of time, but rather progression of the player. So as the player repowers the world, the day-night cycle is going to progress. So I mentioned that we revisited the plans for our main island. So there's a lot of space on that island, and we want to use it effectively and intentionally. So our game has a lot of verticality to it. So we planned out the verticality of our main island. So what you see here is the different levels of verticality for the different objects on the island. On the top, you see where everything will be once the island is powered up. And on the bottom, you see where everything is while it's still dormant. So this is showing what each area of the island is going to be used for. So the island is going to have different difficulty levels according to the player's progress. So as power is restored to areas, the objects on the island are going to move, which will reveal more difficult areas. Additionally, different areas of the island are going to test different player skills, such as using the boost function as well as drifting and dodging. We also got started on planning out our next level. This level is going to include a payload conduction trial. It's going to test the player's ability to aware of what's around them and know how to use the map as much to their advantage as possible. So what you're seeing here is in the center, that center circle, that is actually the island that we used as our visual target at vertical slice. So that gives a little bit of context for what this is going to be like. And then also the slipstreams that are coming out of the center, those blue sort of swirls, they're actually going to be stacked upon each other on the outside, so they're all going to swirl completely. And then along the outside, there's going to be 3 levels of slipstreams to navigate on. We also worked on some action blocks. So moving on slipstreams can sometimes feel like being on a roller coaster, and we wanted to experiment with that so that we could replicate that on purpose. So here we have a couple of action blocks that are showing that we're working on trying to find some ways to replicate the feeling of being on a roller coaster. Okay, moving on. So with our boost camera, we found that we needed to provide more visual feedback to the player when they were gaining speed. Previously, without this boost camera, the only way you could tell that you were going faster was if you had the exact right environmental context. Now this boost camera shows the player that they are in fact moving faster than they were before. We also added a couple of movement mechanics. On the left is our charged jump, and on the right is the beginning of our trick system. So yeah, on the charged jump, we're adding it so that you can use your energy to charge up your jump so you can jump higher and farther. That's going to allow the player to actually use jumping as a skill while navigating the world. The trick system is using procedural animation right now, so it is a work in progress that will be refined. As the player does tricks in the air, they gain a little bit of energy. However, if they don't stick the landing, basically, if they hit something or land while in the middle of a trick, they will not only lose that energy, but a little bit of health as well. And finally, Unreal is Unreal. So you might recall that at Vertical Slice, our demo suffered, at least in part, by it being locked at 30 frames per second. At the time, we thought it was because of the live stream, but we wanted to look into it just to make sure so it wouldn't happen again. And it's good that we did, because we found out that there's actually a bug in the version of Unreal that we're using that causes the game to be locked at 30 frames per second when it's on a duplicated screen. So with that information, we now know that in future presentations, we're going to have to present in a way to avoid that bug. Luckily, it's not a problem over Zoom. That moves us on to process. So like the rest of the world, we have to start working remotely now. So that just means that we have to be a lot more intentional about the ways that we work and communicate. So we made a couple of changes even before knowing that we were going to transition to remote that were really convenient and advantageous for us in this transition. So first of all, we transitioned to using Critical Path instead of Scrum. Like Studio Whip, we used Big Gantt in Jira to lay this out for us. This has been really helpful in transitioning to working remotely because we have everything planned out for the rest of our development time. That means that we don't have to worry about some of the obstacles that we might be facing if we were still using Scrum. So with Scrum, you have to have pretty consistent communication and making decisions and reprioritizing on a pretty regular basis. And we've already done all of that legwork in setting up for Critical Path, so we're lucky with that. Also, shout out to Penguin Void Out. We have adopted their digital daily stand-up. We did that shortly before we learned that we were transitioning to remote, and it has been a lifesaver. It's helped us stay in communication. So thank you, Penguin Void Out, for that idea. It's been very helpful. Good job. We also made additional adjustments once we learned that we would be working remotely. We started using Tandem. For those of you who don't know, Tandem is a collaboration platform. It allows for audio and video chats within rooms that can be freely entered and exited at your will. So it removes the barrier of having to start a call with someone. Everyone can just go somewhere when they want to chat. So we started using this because we were really concerned about maintaining the team's sense of psychological safety. So psychological safety is a sense of belonging on a team and feeling that you're contributing to it without fear of punishment or rejection is basically what psychological safety is. So in order to maintain that, we wanted to make sure that we had casual communication within the team. So when we were at FIO working in the cohort space, that's what gave us that feeling. And we wanted to simulate that using Tandem. So we set up a co-working time of 11 to 3 from Monday through Friday to mimic the times that we know most of our team members would normally be working in the cohort space. And then during that time, our team members enter the co-working channel and they can work alongside each other, the rest of the team. We actually have 2 co-working spaces, one that's regular where people can chit chat and one that's more quiet so you can work quietly alongside your teammates. Another step that we took was setting up a structure for weekly check-ins about productivity between leads and the developers on their teams. So each Monday, the leads meet with all of their developers and discuss the week that they have ahead of them, what's expected of them according to the critical path, and any issues that they might have with staying on that schedule. And then they have a midweek check-in to ensure that all those tasks are remaining on schedule and to make sure that everything is going all right with that developer. And then along with this process, the leads fill out these Google Forms. And that's been very helpful because that, of course, results in a Google Sheet that we can use to stay informed of what's going on with each other's sub-teams without having to worry about the sometimes inconvenient communication when working remotely. And I anticipate that that's going to be really helpful in the future as well to see our progress in certain ways, to see any trends in the way that we are productive. And then also we are working on creating an availability chart that's going to allow each team member to choose times at which they're going to be available. That's going to help us with communication and help provide structure and accountability to our team. We haven't completed that yet because we recognize that people are still transitioning to working remotely individually. So we want to give them time to get used to that before we ask them to make a commitment about their timing. Moving on to critical path, we're going to be using that for the rest of our production cycle. Since vertical slice, we planned out our project to determine our critical path. Like I said, we used Big Gantt in Jira to set that up, but that's neither easy nor interesting to look at. So we've created this super condensed, super simplified version of our critical path. It doesn't include everything. It just includes the major features that we're going to be working on and when they'll be completed. So you can see what's generally planned week by week. The weeks outlined in gold have status update presentations at the end of them, so you can get a general idea of what we plan to have for each presentation. So looking specifically at what we plan to have for the April status update, we plan on having the main island pretty much completed. The only thing is we have a couple of 3D assets that will be finished in the subsequent weeks, so we'll have to replace those later. So these are our time estimates for the level designers. You can see that there are some extra hours left over. Those hours are going to be utilized in preparing for our second island. And then programming here, a lot of our time is going to be spent on combat, which we will have in by next presentation. And then our artist hours. You can see that a lot of our hours are going to be spent on the 3D assets and for our main island and on our main character. So the way that this is set up, each gold category on the left corresponds to a line item on the right. So for example, the enemies category that includes drones and turrets is a total of 24 hours. So these numbers that we have, these estimates, they're based on the data that I shared last month. So for example, a really good way to see this is last month when I was talking about the 3D assets, I said that they averaged either 10 or 15 hours. Right here, we have 150 hours estimated for 12 assets, which averages to 12.5 hours for each asset. So you can see that that's where that's coming from. And with that, we're going to move on to our demo, and Galen is going to take over for that.